Well, hello everyone. Welcome to this webinar on Mind the Gap, video advertising reach in the age of increasing media fragmentation. Welcome to the session wherever you are in the world, be it your morning or your afternoon. We've got a great session today. We've got a guest presenter. His name is Martin Radford on the right. I'll introduce him properly before long. If you don't know me, my name is Matt. I'm on the left. My role at WFA is to provide support and resources to all of our members within the media area. And my colleague Joelle is helping to facilitate this webinar from a technical standpoint today. So we're going to be handing over to Martin shortly, who's going to be taking us through this fascinating research that Ebiquity have recently done. Just before we do that, a very quick intro. Very important to point out that questions, you can send them whenever you like. There is a Q&A widget, should be at the bottom of your screen. You can stick your questions in there. We will ensure we reserve enough time at the end of the session to ask Martin whatever questions you might have. So please do send those over. Now, welcome to all of our members. This, as you may know, the WFA is composed of 60 or so national advertiser associations, and many of you are joining from these associations today. And of course, we also have 120 or so corporate companies in membership. And it's worth saying that our agenda is always based on your priorities, whatever they might be. In usual times, I guess, we would be focusing on topics such as agency models, programmatic, brand safety, internal capabilities, and indeed cross-media measurement. But these are not normal times, are they? Everyone is focused on managing media in crisis right now. And we did a webinar last week, which uncovered that there were some pretty stark reductions in ad spend going on. On average, 23% fall in ad spend in the first half of 2020. And naturally, that trend is much more pronounced in some sectors, with travel being significantly badly hit. So these are not normal times, but we shouldn't let the COVID-19 crisis prompt a loss of sight of our key strategic priorities. So back to the topic, and I wanted just to flash this up. It's an interesting chart from Comscore, which illustrates where different markets in the world sit in terms of maturity, if you like, for cross-media measurement. And the phases which were across the top represent a certain sort of trajectory towards cross-media measurement, sort of, again, a maturity level, with phase 5 perhaps being the most advanced state where you might get to a true cross-media measurement place. And you can argue whether these countries are placed entirely exactly in the right place, but I think it's probably more or less an accurate representation. And it's clear that we are going to need, buy-in from the whole industry to really get to that top right-hand quadrant. And we're probably going to need hybrid approaches, leveraging both panel and census as well, to really understand campaigns in a fragmented digital world in which we live in. So just as a sort of an aside to what Martin's about to talk about, WFA has been trying to help implement that kind of cross-media measurement solution. We're trying to help expedite the implementation of those solutions on a local level. And we've got this working group together, which is cross-industry. It's advertiser-centric, but cross-industry, and it's represented by the sell side, the measurement companies, and other protagonists as well. And the intention from what we're trying to do here is to set some principles on a global level which represent a consensus for how cross-media measurement could be done to reach that top hand right quadrant. So we're making some progress here, and you should see some more information on this coming out before long. We believe that there is a new paradigm needed in media measurement, and we have this North Star which has been prescribed to us by a number of our advertiser members. They've said that what they really want is full life cycle measurement, which should span planning, intra-campaign optimization, and post-campaign reporting, and that should enable cross-media, deduplicated reach and frequency across all media, well, internet protocol media really, and TV as well. So TV and digital, and that should be continuous, a tagless, always on data capture model, so you don't have to have tags or anything like that to set the thing up. It should be comprehensive, covering all of TV and all of digital, not just video. Ideally, would be going beyond that to other formats as well. And really, it should be this kind of solutions I think we need are those which are hybrid in nature, which enable you to pick up on campaigns perhaps sub the 100 rating level, which is sometimes hard to do with panel-only solutions. And ideally, the sort of the new paradigm in media measurement would be full funnel solutions, which have reach and frequency outputs, but also means to tether to outcomes measurements such as MMM, attribution, brand lift, and other outcome studies. So this is what we're trying to help the industry arrive at. And it's an interesting global and local handoff, because while we can set global principles, measurement lives locally, and it's for local organizations to actually implement this stuff. So we're working very closely with a number of our association members, ANA, ISBA, and many others besides, to try and set global principles which lend themselves to local implementation. So more on that soon. It's a pretty exciting piece of work. But in the meantime, we have Martin, and there are fantastic things that can be done with panel-based solutions. And Ebiquity have got this fascinating study here, which we're going to hear more from shortly. So we're just going to hand over to Martin. Before we do, I wanted to take the opportunity to run a quick poll to you guys today. We've got quite a lot of people in this webinar, nearly 100. So it's been interesting just to take the pulse for you guys today. So I'm curious to know, to what extent are you dependent on digital platforms to extend the reach of your TV campaigns? Do you see digital platforms as a means to extend your TV campaigns, or do you use digital platforms for other purposes? So I'm assuming we've got enough answers now, so I'm going to ask Joelle to project these on screen. Highly dependent, right? I think that's what we might have imagined. So most of you, 54% of you, are highly dependent on platforms to extend the reach of your TV campaigns. It makes sense. You know, incremental reach is what we've been looking for some time. The question is, are those audiences as good quality in those environments as they are on TV? And that's what we're going to hear a little bit more from Martin now. It's part of your presentation, isn't it, Martin?
It is absolutely, yes, and I'm very pleased to see those results in the way that they came out. Thanks for joining. I hope you're all safe and well in these interesting times. The way that media is evolving is it feels like it's evolving more quickly than it's done at any point in my media career, and I've been in the industry for nearly 25 years, and particularly in the last probably 6 months or so, it feels like the change in the UK has accelerated away. And this study is primarily focused on the UK, but I'll come on to talk about the company who we ran this study with and some of their findings that they have in some of the other markets that they operate in. But just to focus on what we see in the UK at the minute, Netflix is obviously the dominant platform that everybody thinks of when they think about subscription VOD services. Disney Plus has just launched over here about 2 weeks ago. A fantastic time and a virtual babysitter for an awful lot of people, no doubt. In America, I think they were running about 3.5 million subscribers ahead of forecasts after about 3 months of being live. Obviously, Prime Video comes along with an awful lot of with people's shopping accounts. Facebook and YouTube are the dominant digital platforms that are starting to challenge broadcasters like ITV here in the UK, and ITV and BBC have joined together to form BritBox, which again is a subscription VOD service to try and challenge the dominance of companies like Netflix as well. So this pace of change is evolving ever more quickly. This is looking at the UK households who subscribe to an SVOD service in millions, and you can see it's pretty much a straight line as we've gone over the last 4 or 5 years. How that changes this year remains to be seen. Obviously, you've got an awful lot of economic pressures, but then again, you've got people like Disney entering the market with potentially a very, very attractive offering to consumers. And we make no apologies for focusing on television. This is from work that we did across 2014 to 2017, and it's the average profit ROI by medium taken across that 4-year period that you see at the bottom there. And you can see how TV dominates, both in terms of the share of the budget that it takes, but also the ROI that it can deliver. It can deliver mass reach very, very quickly. It has the benefit of being audio and visual. And generally people pay an awful lot of attention to the adverts. Some of the newer challenges on the market, such as online video and online display, aren't quite so prominent in their ability to drive a business return for advertisers. But because of this changing landscape, our clients are asking similar questions to the one that Matt's just asked you. How much incremental reach can digital channels deliver? Just because you spend a lot of time on platforms doesn't necessarily mean that the adverts are reaching more people than the TV campaign does in its own right. How do you best allocate budgets across that, across the different media? That's one that's given particularly to our effectiveness divisions, and one which is proving a far bigger nut to crack in terms of the complexity, particularly in how you can trade some of these digital platforms. How you best compete for attention. There's a lot of discussion in the UK at the minute about attention to advertising, and I did this presentation at an Attention Council conference about 3 weeks ago, which feels like about 5 years. But attention is key. Just because the advert is able to be seen, it doesn't necessarily mean that people are seeing it. And how your creative can give you a competitive advantage as well. And we'll come back to talk a little bit about that at the minute. And those of you who may be familiar with Orlando Wood's work, Lemon, that he did for the IPA, again, fascinating insight into how advertising is changing, just the advert itself. And if you're not familiar, I recommend that you look that up. And finally, how do you bring all of these together in a meaningful way? So about a year ago, we launched TV at the Tipping Point. This was a study of the TV market in the UK. We'd seen inflation in the market. We have a dynamic pricing approach in the UK where the price is a function of the amount of money in the market and the number of people watching television. And what we were seeing was audiences were falling, revenue was doing okay, it was on the increase, and there was inflation in the market. Yet at the same time, there was the level of reach that your campaigns could deliver was falling. So you had a combination of inflation, falling reach, that therefore meant the cost of reach was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And this meant that advertisers couldn't afford the weight of campaigns that they used to. And equally, they were reaching fewer people than they used to. So they started to turn to the digital platforms to try and boost that reach, hopefully at a more competitive price. So Tipping Point was released last year. And there were some comments in the market that we didn't look at broadcast to VOD and we hadn't considered digital. So early in 2019, just having released TV at the Tipping Point, we then started work on what became known as Mind the Gap. And that was assessing what digital can add to linear television campaigns. Now, this is one of the key charts from Tipping Point's work. This is taking all commercial impacts in the UK, starting in 2010, and we've indexed everything off that 2010 level. So basically, as you can see, the line for 16 to 17-year-old declines. That means that there are fewer impacts commercial impacts being delivered each year relative to 2010. Now, 2010 is a fairly arbitrary starting point. It's a nice round number, but also it gave us a few years run up to 2013, when all households in the UK had access to multi-channel television. So they had access to numerous services, not just the terrestrial services. And the pattern is fairly clear. The younger the audience, generally the sharper decline. There's a little bit of a move around here, 25, 34s and 35, 44s, where maybe there's a bit of a life stage thing as children arrive and you find yourself watching more television. But broadly, the younger audiences have been in decline, and if you shift these curves back on top of one another, the angle of the curve is very, very similar. The reason that we called it TV at the Tipping Point was 2018 was the first time that 45 to 54s had seen the commercial impact level drop down below that 2010 level. So this audience has dropped down. The older audiences, 55 to 64 and 65 plus, had continued to grow. And in the UK now, these three audiences account for 76% of all commercial impacts on television. So we start to think that maybe one of the reasons that television is so strong and produces that consistent ROI despite the inflating price and despite the declining reach is actually this audience here, and particularly maybe these two, are the economically powerful audiences. Generally, the children will have left home, there'll be a bit more money around, and they watch an awful lot of television, therefore they drive the ROI. The dotted line is where we thought the numbers were going to go in 2019. So we thought that 16, 17-year-olds would decline further, etc., etc. And we were quite ballsy in saying that we thought 55s and over would both continue to grow their audience, their level of impact relative to the year before. So that's what we saw. It got quite a lot of commentary in the press. Some of it was quite on the front foot, should we say. And Mark Ritson, who I'm sure most of you are familiar with, was very complimentary in some of his comments that he put forward. So how do we stand up against the reality? So this chart here, the grey is what we thought the forecast was going to be, and the blue is the actuality. So for 16 to 17-year-olds, we thought the market would be down 22% in 2019. In actuality, the market was down just over 35%. And we were wrong for all audiences up to 45 to 54s. The market suffered a greater decline of commercial impacts than we thought would happen. The call that we made saying that these older audiences would grow impacts was actually right. We slightly underestimated 55, 64s, and we were slightly over on 65 pluses. But in aggregate, we thought the market would be down about 3.5%, and actually it was down about 4.5%. But this decline and this acceleration of some of these younger audiences, and obviously Mark Ritson then had to put forward some ideas about how people's media consumption habits change as they get older, in reference to Dire Straits. All of these audiences were continuing to fall away, and we've seen similar patterns coming into this year before the COVID-19 situation. So the conversation is still very much live, and it is very much about minding the gap between your TV campaigns and the reach that they used to deliver and what they deliver now. So let me give you a bit of background on the research that we did. So we owe our thanks to Audience Project, who some of you may be familiar with. They're a Danish company. They operate in the Nordics and the UK and Germany, and this year they'll be, I think, moving into France and the US. And they are the engine behind this. They run a digital panel in the UK, which numbers about 400,000 individuals. It's weighted to be in line with the online universe. And we can track the exposure of advertising to their panelists using tags on the ads that are put forward. They've then developed a fusion methodology with TechEdge in the UK, so we can take their data from their panel, Audience Project data and panel, and fuse it with the Barb data, the TV data, using TechEdge. We also spoke to Lumen, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the data that they helped provide. Lumen are an eye tracking company here, and they look at the amount of attention that people are paying to adverts and why the variances may be. System One, again, I referenced them earlier on, but they very much about the quality of the advertising. We'll come to talk a little bit about that later on. And T-Vision are an American company. They've also done work in territories like Japan, and they are focused on attention to TV advertising, so that they have webcams in people's living room, watching what people are doing when the television's on. Lumen, I should point out, are focused primarily on non-TV attention. So using all those partners, the study includes YouTube and Facebook. They're the primary ones. That's what we'll focus on today. We also had one advertiser use Twitter and Spotify. And there was STV is a commercial broadcaster in the UK. It's part of the ITV group. And the STV broadcaster VOD platform is the only one that allows tagging or third-party tagging of adverts on its platform. The other broadcasters don't allow tagging, and therefore, although we wanted them to take part in the study, we couldn't reach it, or they weren't willing to take part in that. Obviously, we hope that at some point in the near future, data will be available for those. And the way that we described it was that we wanted to measure what digital channels add to linear TV activity. We were quite clear in that when we talked to our clients. And when we set out, we wanted different agency groups, we wanted different sectors, different trading audiences, and different target audiences. We just thought it was as broad a skew as possible. And we ended up with 5 advertisers and 15 campaigns, which covered our requirements for this work. All the campaigns were chosen by the participants, and they were aware that we were looking at purely understanding additional coverage. There were a couple of clients who said actually we don't want to take part because we see YouTube as being for a different purpose, or we use Facebook for a different message, and we don't see it as being purely incremental. And we'll talk about digital data in a couple of different ways. We'll talk about it at impression level, so that is the ad is recording as being served. It didn't necessarily have to appear on screen, people didn't have to pay any attention to it, but it was recorded as served. And we'll also look at the data which is available in the various ad manager platforms at 50% and 100% completion for the adverts in the study as well. And what we found was really quite interesting. So looking at different age groups along the bottom here, what you see here in the boxes is the proportion of the overall universe that these groups make up. So bearing in mind that I said that this 45 plus group make up 76% of all impacts, they make up about 47% of all people, and these numbers here exclude children, which is why they don't add up to 100. So for 16 to 24s, the highest level of reach that we saw for a TV campaign was about 65%. For Facebook or YouTube, the highest level of reach was in the high 80%. So, and this is all at impression level. So on the face of it, Facebook and YouTube have the potential to deliver more reach for a campaign against this particular audience than television does. And particularly given the relative cost, TV would be extremely expensive to deliver that. For 25 to 34s, we see a slight narrowing of the gap. TV is much closer to the digital platforms. 35 to 44s, everyone's pretty much on top of themselves, around the mid 70s or so. And then as we move into TV's heartland, the supremacy that they've got delivering reach for these audiences is clear. Now, what we don't know is whether the digital platforms would struggle to deliver this level of reach. You could maybe argue that they would do, because not everyone's parents are on Facebook, or whether the campaigns that we took, or that took part in this study, were overtly skewing towards under 45 audiences. Now, most of the clients who took part in this work were my own clients at Ebiquity, and certainly the conversations that we'd had in reviews in recent times was how reach was falling against these younger audiences, and how it therefore made sense to target digital towards the audience that you weren't reaching through television. This audience has remained very, very steady in television terms in recent years. So we see digital being able to deliver better reach at younger audiences, and then TV's supremacy at these older audiences, the mass market, being much more consistent. But there's quite a lot of variation within the data as well. If we look on the left-hand side, the reach curves for 16 to 24. So ratings along the bottom, and this is an average of TV's coverage delivery for 16 to 24. It's taken from 30 different brands, 10 who are trading 16 to 34 advertisers, 10 who are trading up market, and 10 who are trading housekeepers and children. So the average curve sits there. When we add YouTube on, we see that YouTube's curve, and we've cut it off a little bit before we reach the end of the curve, but you can see that YouTube is able to deliver quicker coverage at a rating for rating level, at an impression level, than television is. When we add Facebook in, we see Facebook is more akin to television. It starts quite quickly, and then the reach starts to plateau out. So in terms of speed of reach, YouTube is potentially better than YouTube or Facebook or television. But again, within that, we see the differences when we look at the maximum here are for the two platforms and minimum. Now, this was a bit of a surprise to us. We didn't delve into how people were trading these digital platforms. We let them target as they want to. We had one advertiser buy non-skippable advertising, and their cover curve was slightly quicker than the YouTube maximum. But the Facebook variation is quite stark, and Facebook are quite open in the way that you can buy their platform. You can buy very, 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 very high levels of reach. The chances are that people won't watch your ad to completion, but it will be very cheap. Or you can pay a higher price, have more chance of people watching your ad to completion, but get much lower reach on the back of it. So this is the variation that we see with Facebook, while YouTube is much more narrow in its potential delivery. We then look at some of the audience curves for the cohorts where TV is more dominant. We see that YouTube is about as good as television for a given level of weight in terms of 45-54s. Facebook struggles. And then as we move into this older 55 to 64, YouTube again is slightly lower, and Facebook much below the level of television. So we see some variation coming through between audiences as well. And obviously these campaigns weren't delivering much more weight against these audiences because they were presumably targeted towards the younger group. So at impression level, YouTube coverage operates in a much narrower band. If you're going to buy YouTube, then you can be fairly certain of the level of impression level reach that you'll get. Facebook's coverage, because of the way that you can trade on that platform, for all age ranges, has much more variation. And TV reach is comparable or better than YouTube and Facebook for 45s and older. For the younger viewer, the lighter viewer, those who are potentially more valuable to some advertisers, both the digital channels offer a potentially more efficient way to build reach than linear television does currently. And at low levels of reach, some of the participating brands saw cover curves build more quickly than that of television. And this was one of the questions that we had from Direct Line Group, who are happy for us to talk about them being as a participant. One of their early questions was, is it possible to build 30% reach for a brand without using telly and do it more quickly and more cost effectively using digital channels? And at an impression level, yes, it is possible to do that. But we have to ask the question whether all impressions are equal. And our view is that when you look at the attention, not all impressions are equal. So this is data from TVision in the States, taken from 2019. So for everybody who watches a 30-second ad, on average, they will watch about 14 seconds they'll pay attention to the screen for 14 seconds. That's not to say that if they look away, they're not listening to the advert as well. So we're all aware of the power of sonic triggers. When we look at the other platforms that were part of this study, we see the level of reach, the level of attention to be much lower. So these ones in light blue here, this is essentially YouTube and Facebook. And then we come on to some of the older, more traditional methods, such as press and out of home, coupled with more modern approaches such as desktop MPU and mobile MPU. And it's interesting, particularly at this lower level, if you're getting anywhere near 2 seconds of attention for some of your adverts on these platforms, then you're doing well. But we see here that TV is far more dominant than these other platforms in terms of garnering people's attention. And Dave Trott, who some of you may be familiar with, one of his comments about advertising is one of the big questions is, will anybody even notice it? So we need to consider attention paid to adverts as well as just data at impression level. And that means that not all coverage is equal. If we take two campaigns here, on the left-hand side, a campaign targeted towards 16 to 24s. At impression level, the TV campaign got 52% reach. YouTube got 72% reach, and Facebook got 59%. When we then factor in 50% completion rates, we see quite a stark change. Now, the data that we have for television doesn't go down to this level of granularity. And we did debate whether we should adjust our numbers to take account of the data that we've just seen from TVision, but we decided that we would then be moving too much around. It would be based upon broad averages, whereas the data that we have for YouTube and Facebook is specific to the campaign itself. So all the TV data that we see here is as recorded by Barb, and we make no adjustments to it. So at a 50% completion rate, TV remains at 52, YouTube drops to 26, and Facebook, who was at 59% at the impression level, moves to 2% at a 50% completion rate. At 100%, TV obviously remains the same, YouTube moves to 16%, and Facebook became slightly bigger than 0. So quite stark drops for the digital channels. You can assume that a similar level of decline would go on for television, which, if that is the case, becomes really a really interesting question, because therefore, if all the data that we see for television assumes that attention is 100%, if it's not, so it makes TV a more powerful medium, because people are getting that message, they're driving the ROI through incomplete viewing of the adverts. But this pattern that we see here was a key one. When we look at an older targeted brand, 35 to 44s, we see a similar pattern, 70% reach for television, 74% on YouTube drops down to 9%, and for Facebook, 26%, so they're buying one of the more expensive, low reach, hopefully high completion levels, becomes again just over zero at 100% completion. And this pattern was true across all the campaigns that we saw. And in every case, the drop off on YouTube from impression to 100% was far less than the drop off was on Facebook. And it is possible to put a guide on how much incremental coverage you'll get to a TV campaign when you use YouTube and Facebook. And this is done as a 50% completion rate. So what we saw on average was at 150 ratings, a combination of YouTube and Facebook would give you 4 points of additional coverage. At 250 ratings, it would give you 6 points of coverage, so on and so forth. Just to put it in perspective, if you got this 7 points of extra coverage at 300 ratings, it's the equivalent for a TV cover curve from about 7 years ago. So it offers an awful lot of incremental benefit. Now, for housekeepers and children and ABC One ads, the numbers are flatter. There are two suppositions here. One is that the brands weren't overtly targeting housekeepers and children, and therefore they were sort of coming along as a byproduct. And for ABC One ads, an awful lot of this audience are over 45s, and we've seen that the digital platforms don't necessarily cater particularly strongly for that. So what we're looking for this year in the UK is more housekeepers and children targeted brands and some more ABC Ones. And I've got a call straight after this session with an advertiser who trades ABC Ones, and their target audience is 45 to 64. So it'll be interesting to see if we can get them part of the study and to understand how digital can help them offset the changes in the TV market. So this is using YouTube and Facebook. If we then look at what happened on the less used platforms, so Spotify and Twitter, like I said, this was just one advertiser used these and one advertiser used SDV Player. For both of this, so this campaign here was a very, very heavyweight relaunch of a brand over here, and Spotify delivers a very strong level of coverage. The target audience was 35 to 54, so it's delivering a decent level of coverage and well targeted as well. It's interesting it moves older as well. Twitter again added some unique reach, but at a lower level. And again, the advertiser who ran this also ran moat tracking, so they could see the quality of the engagement. And it was a very, very short ad which appeared at the top of the Explore section in Twitter. Very few people watched the ad to completion, even though it was 4 seconds. And an even smaller proportion of those watched the ad with the sound on as well. So again, just because an impression is served doesn't necessarily mean to say that the advert is being adapted to the platform itself. So a question from Jerry D'Angelo. It doesn't take account, well, essentially sorry, Jerry's question is, does this take account creative adapted to platform? What we didn't control for anything that advertisers were doing. We purely looked at the ads that they were running. Now, Facebook, I think freely admit that about 40% of their ads in the UK that they run on their platform are TV ads, and they think that they're not the best way of using the platform. So actually, the two advertisers who probably engaged with this study most heavily have both taken it to their creative agencies to get them to understand how people consume their advertising, and on Facebook in particular to try to run shorter, more impactful ads where the message can come across in a much more concise way. Sorry for digressing there for a second. So attention in the TV world. It used to feel that this is what television used to be like. Everyone would sit on the sofa and pay lots of attention. And now it feels it's a bit more like this, with the box in the corner not getting quite the attention that it used to. And if we look at some of the data that TVision have found in the US, and we compare this again with UK data to try and draw some similarities. So in the States, on average, 44% of the first ad in a break or a pod gets attention. When we move into the middle of the break, it's 14.5%, and last is 40.9%. In the UK, we focus the quality measures of advertising in break as being first, second, and last in break. Research that Ebiquity or billets in those days did showed that the average level of recall for advertising was about 42%. So numbers haven't moved on that much in the last 20 odd years. But if we look at the growth in audience between those who watch live and those who then watch the adverts on record, we see there's a similar pattern. So for all adults, first, if you have an advert first in break, you'll get about 15% more impacts when the consolidated viewing comes through than the live audience. And then we see middle as lower and last in break as lower still. But again, this first in break ties in with the T-Vision data for all adults. When we look at the elusive 16 to 34, then we see the numbers are even greater. So 25, 26% more viewers come through on average from a first in break ad compared to 15 and about 12 from middle or last in break. So focus on position in break is still important, but first in break is perhaps more important still. And we touched right at the start when we talked about tipping point, about the change in viewing behavior by audience. Again, this is data from T-Vision in the US, and it's this one I want to focus your attention on, no pun intended, which is how much attention is being paid to the advertising itself by age group. And what you can see is that the younger age group pay less attention than anybody else. And broadly, it goes up and up and up as you get, and then over 65, so it drops back a little bit. But again, this is something which maybe hasn't come across a lot of people's radars in the work that we're doing in the UK. But for these younger audiences, it's actually harder to get their attention when even though you're putting a message in front of them. And if we look at the data that we saw for YouTube and Facebook, and we're kind of using this as a proxy, but we're looking at the drop-off between coverage at impression level and the coverage at 50% completion. So what we see here for YouTube is for over 65s, the drop-off is about 92%. For Facebook, it's about 55%. And then as we move through the age groups, what we see is a broadly similar pattern. We don't have any data for under 16s, but you can see the declining in attention for the younger audiences for TV in the States is mirrored by the data that we see for Facebook in the blue, and a similar pattern for YouTube in the red as well. So again, we're starting to see that younger audiences are paying less attention to the advertising. And again, if we look at what's gone on in the UK, it's where we start to broaden the conversation out to talk a bit more about the quality of the creative and how important that can be in driving ROI. So what we've seen in the UK is, because light viewers, the third of the audience who watch the lowest level of television, because they're moving away or they may be only watching a small number of minutes a day, it's very, very hard to deliver incremental coverage relative to your competition. So this is taken from, this is 5 brands taken from the middle of 2019 who are in the banking sector, and we've got ratings on the bottom and we've got coverage up the side. And in days of old, what we might expect to see is quite a large variation of maybe sort of 6, 7, 8, so sometimes even 10 points of coverage at a reasonable weight of advertising, because buyers were they used to be good buyers who could adjust their channel mix. They could buy the campaign in a way that would deliver better reach than the competition. But what we see increasingly now is that all the cover curves sit increasingly on top of each other. And that's a real problem when we talk about the shifting of TV's tectonic plates with falling limited campaign reach and price inflation. It means that it's very, very hard for advertisers now to outshout the competition just because the budgets aren't there. You can't necessarily blow people out of the water by buying a sheer weight of advertising. And ultimately, we within the industry need to adapt and develop ways of understanding how campaigns appear in the eye of the consumer, which is why things like attention and the quality of the creative is so important. So again, we go back to our friends at T-Vision, and this is data from Japan looking at campaign weight and the difference between the attention, so also the awareness for ads that have low viewability and low attention compared to ads that have high viewability and high attention. So at 1,000 GRPs, high viewability and high attention ads get 6.6 points greater awareness. If we turn that around into maybe something that you and your procurement teams will understand better as well, it takes 200 to 300% more spend to deliver that same level of awareness. And we spend an awful lot of time measuring the price, the exposure, the placement of advertising, but rarely do we actually look at the advert itself and how that can play a key role in driving all of this. So to summarize, at the most basic impression level, TV, YouTube, and Facebook all have the potential to deliver similar levels of reach for under 45s. For over 45s, TV remains unrivaled in the UK. You can achieve incremental coverage using digital video channels, particularly for younger audiences, and that is true at all weights of advertising. But once you factor in the quality of engagement, online video may not be enough to close the coverage gap. And even the channels which are favoured by those younger ages do not escape. The younger the audience, the less attention is paid to advertising. So what do brands need to consider as we move forwards? First of all, understand what the coverage gap is. We had no idea what we were going to find when we did this work, and it's the variation between brands is quite marked from those who took part. Take a more granular approach to measurement. It was only a few years ago that we used to see digital plans with KPIs of impressions and not much else on there. So understand more about online video, specifically how you can trade these platforms and factor in the cost and the delivery. And to Jerry's point earlier on, make the right creative for the right channel, both in the format and the message. So if the ad is going to be consumed in a split second or two, make sure that the ad is fit for purpose. And use structured testing to evaluate and optimize the channels that are available to you to fill the coverage gap. Now, when we put this together, someone said we need to sort of put in perspective what we see or how we see television. And I asked a colleague of mine how he sees it, and he came straight back with the answer, which was a very good one, and I've shamelessly used it ever since. He said, TV is like Usain Bolt. It's not quite as good as it used to be, but as you can see from the picture here, it gets an awful lot of attention. And although there are some challenges to its position in the market, nobody can quite match its legacy.
That's fantastic, Martin. Very, very interesting indeed. I'm just going to invite anyone to put their questions into the Q&A widget. If you do have some, send them over. Clearly, we've had one or two trickling in. Thanks for that one earlier, Jerry. So that is really interesting study, Martin. Really interesting indeed. So are you seeing clients reappraise whether it makes sense to advertise on platforms at all?
Absolutely. Well, I think it's a slightly different question. Like I said, the brands who are most engaged with this are now going, right, how do I use the platform to the best of its ability? My view is, and I was initially a buyer at Zenith for 5 years before I moved to this side of the fence. My view is always use the platform to the best of its ability. We don't often see people using television with strange day of week mixes or deciding that they don't want to run anything beyond Saturday lunchtime because everyone's at the shops. It's the same thing with the digital platforms. If you think about how you consume Facebook in particular, where you flick through and occasionally you'll stop, that's how the consumer does it. They don't necessarily see that this is a teaser campaign and this is a launch campaign and this is a different message. They just scroll through and adverts are put in front of them. So the conversations are very much about how to fit advertising to the platform. And Sam Taylor, who some of you may know at Direct Line, has been quite public in his in what he's talked about, which is he's trying to work out what platform he needs to pivot to when TV becomes inefficient from a cost point of view in terms of delivering reach. So where does he go next? So he then looks at it from platform A, platform B, platform C at impression level. And then if I factor in completed views, where does that shift the equation? And then if I factor in things like sound on, where does that factor in? How does that change the equation as well? So it's become a much more granular approach. The key bit of data that we're missing in the UK is broadcast to VOD, because that would give us a real, not quite 360, but it would give us 350-degree view of how the market is.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you might say you're also missing granular data on how TV ads are being consumed in terms of second by second. I don't think we have that.
In the UK we have. TVision have got it for a vast majority of American adverts. So there are some conversations going on there about how we can understand their data more. But it's interesting, to see the brands some of the brands who are involved with your initiative are also brands who are involved in areas such as understanding attention and the quality of creative as well.
And there's a question here that says the study, as you identify, the study focused mostly on the UK. Would you expect the same results across other markets as well, Germany, France, Russia, and further?
I think so. Sorry, I meant to mention that in the presentation. I think we probably would do. So it's possible to do this work in Germany, and we've done some work with a German broadcaster about 3 or 4 years ago, where we'd seen a similar level of decline in TV viewing, TV commercial impacts that we saw in the UK. So 16 to 17-year-olds had dropped, and then the other age groups were starting to follow afterwards. I think other areas like America are in a similar position. When we started to get the data coming through, and we were seeing this quite large variation in Facebook and a much narrower range of performance from YouTube, we talked to the team at Audience Project and said, are we getting the right data? And they said, yeah, that's absolutely the case with what they see in other markets as well. So like I said, mainly in the Nordics, but they see YouTube as generally building coverage more quickly than Facebook does, and Facebook has a much wider variation because of the ways you can trade it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and another question here. There is a lot of focus on innovation in digital communication assets, but not enough on TV. So what, in your view, Martin, are some of the great innovations done for TV recently?
Blimey. That's a
good question.
That's a question, Hub. In terms of can I ask a supplementary question? Is that in terms of the quality of the creative?
I think that's a fair read.
Yeah, okay.
Well, yeah, maybe we can infer the quality of creative, but also maybe in terms of sort of techniques. There's not been that much innovation in the TV space, has there really, in terms of how ads are sort of available?
No, it's true. In terms of the way that people advertise, again, I'll point you towards Orlando and his System 1 work, but adverts that have a sense of place, have a sense of family, have a togetherness, have a narrative, have humour, are very, very strong. They always tend to score well, and the System 1 work points to them being very good at driving long-term brand health, not just short-term ROI. We've seen examples of advertisers, and I've worked with a couple where you can have I'll take a random example of it's Easter. So here's an Easter egg, and it's £2, and it's a 10-second advert. And then you might have another advert where it's an Easter egg and it's in a family setting, and you can see maybe a child eating it, and it's organic and it's £2. And the supposition is that the people will go for the organic chocolate one because there's a reason to buy it, there's a benefit to you buying it, or maybe it's fair trade. So adverts that focus too much on purely pushing a price message and not a reason to buy or a benefit to buy, I think that's a big thing that will come out of this. And I was looking at an ad, I was watching telly last night, and there's a new Vodafone ad, which is very much about people doing things online. It's got the Come Together by the Beatles. It's not them singing it, but it's got that as the soundtrack. It's a really sort of positive, uplifting ad, and I imagine it will score really well. And I do wonder if, coming on the back of everything that we're going through at the minute, whether the quality of advertising will change and it will become more light-hearted because people will feel a need to put a better message in front of people. Just one other point to this, which is it's sort of related to your point about how you can buy television ads. Television's great benefit is that it reaches everybody. If you buy a spot in the football, you'll reach young, old, male, female, upmarket, downmarket. If you buy a spot in X Factor, it's the same thing. Over here, the most popular show when it's on, in terms of advertisers wanting a spot in it, is the Bake Off. You know, it's a mix of folks baking. It's everybody watches it, but the industry is talking increasingly about being able to micro-target, and it comes with a cost implication as well. That feels to me like maybe the wrong way that TV needs to shift. TV needs to remember that its benefit is it reaches everybody. You know, nobody listening to this presentation will have consumers purely in a certain age range. Everybody, apart from pensions, everybody buys your product. So I think that is another thing to bear in mind as well. Just, you know, look at the broadness that television delivers.
Yeah, yeah. Good point. And this is a great one. So it's very clear, isn't it, that we need ads to be viewable, fraud-free, brand safe. But increasingly, it feels like, well, you know, surprise, surprise, they need to be, you know, people need to give attention to them as well. Yeah. So does this become a KPI to optimize? I don't know how, but is this a KPI to optimize, or even a metric to trade? Should it replace, in fact, coverage as a differentiator?
Tom Ashby, good morning, sir. Really interesting one. We've used attention for a press client of mine, or press advertiser of mine. They moved to buying interesting formats. So they were buying the bookends. So basically there's a strip, if you can imagine, on the left-hand side of the left-hand page and the right-hand side of the right-hand page. And we'd seen a few advertisers move towards this, and they had some titles were charging up to 100% premium, and some titles were selling it at a 15% discount. So in a conversation with the client, we said, look, if you're going to move to these funky formats and potentially put yourself into premium territory, you need to understand whether it actually works better than a normal ad. So we did 2 studies with Lumen, who looked at the last time that the client had used press advertising and there's new formats, and they found that there was a marked increase, in terms of more than 50%, a marked increase of spontaneous awareness of the brand for when people had read that paper. And on the back of that, the client then had a figure in mind as to what level of premium he was prepared to pay, because he could see a benefit on the back of it. So we advocate using that sort of information while the campaign is live. If you can do it beforehand, there's no reason why you can't run a couple of different copies and work out which one is best. Now, in terms of replacing coverage as a measure, we have done some work with combining some of the System 1 data and the data that I showed you for the cover curves in the finance sector, to try and understand how you might express the maybe the quality of the advertising in relation to the coverage. It's not quite attention, but it's close to it. And if Tom, if you want to discuss that further, then feel free to drop me a line. We'd love to do some work with you.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, we're nearly there. Last question or so. What do you think about other platforms, Martin? Are these trends going to be true of TikTok?
This is where I start to feel really old. Interesting, we did have some data for Instagram from the study, which we managed to pull out separately, and their attention or the completion rate for those was lower than it was on Facebook. Speaking personally, I'm quite aware of advertising on Facebook, and I have bought things off. Sorry, on Instagram, I have bought things off adverts on Instagram. So there seems to be a case in there. It's just a question, I think, of whether you catch people's attention and how you do it.
Well, listen, it's a fantastic study. Thank you very much for sharing it.
Thank you.
And we really look forward to the second round, because I think you're going to be able to continue to put out some really useful stuff here.
Okay.
So thank you again, Martin. I really enjoyed that. Really, really useful. And thank you everyone for joining. And please do tune into our next webinars, which are coming up at a pretty steady drumbeat in these challenging times. Everyone's at home. Everyone's keen to plug into these things. So keep an eye on our website. There's lots of new things coming through. Okay. Thanks again all, and have a fantastic day ahead.
Thanks, Matt.
Bye-bye.